We are live streaming this on Facebook, and Facebook automatically records the live stream. And for those of you that are on Facebook, if you have a question, please use the chat in Facebook. And for those of you joining us via Zoom, we are also live on Zoom, and we are recording this webinar on Zoom as well. And for those of you that have questions on Zoom, please use the chat box. I will be monitoring that. You can ask your questions as they come up. We will try to answer them real time. At the end of this webinar, we also have a poll. We would appreciate it when we post a poll. If you just take a few moments to fill it out for us, as we are nonprofit grant funded, so your input is important for us to be able to continue to provide these services. We're going to get right into it. Today, I'd like to welcome Ben Jones and Atlee Reilly. They're lawyers through Disability Rights Maine, and they prepared for us special education during COVID-19. So with that, I'll turn it over to both of you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for having us, and thank everyone for joining, whatever form you're joining in. Both Ben and I kind of prefer, I think, if we have questions along the way. So use the chat functions. It's being moderated by a couple folks, and they'll let us finish whatever sentence we're on, and then we'll try and get to your question. We're both attorneys at Disability Rights Maine. Disability Rights Maine is the protection and advocacy agency for the state of Maine. We provide legal services and advocacy services to people with disabilities across, the whole life cycle and across all subject areas. But Ben and I focus exclusively on the rights of children, and primarily on the rights of children with disabilities in schools. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to bounce back and forth, the two of us, and we may interrupt each other from time to time, and hopefully you're going to be interrupting us with questions, but we're happy to have you join us today. And Ben's going to start with kind of some results of a survey that we had, and I just got an email 10 minutes ago with the results of a survey that Maine Parent Federation and the DD Council and others did, and I just wanted to highlight a couple things. It seemed like 42% of the people that were surveyed, or the parents surveyed, how to kind of keep their children connected to school was the number one concern that they have going on. So, it seems pervasive. And the other thing that stuck out to me was that 17% still hadn't had any contact from their schools, which at this point is completely unacceptable. So I'm glad you're here. My guess is that a lot of you are in that 42% bucket, and this is one of your primary concerns. I just want to preview that there's not a lot of black and white right now. And so some of our answers are going to be unsatisfactory, but we're going to kind of talk to you about how we're thinking through the gray. And this is a very fluid situation, and the things we say today may be outdated tomorrow, to be honest. But we're going to give you kind of the best up-to-date kind of framework to think about this. And reasonable minds might disagree with some of the things we're going to say, but it's kind of our thoughts. I'm going to try and now share my screen to show you the presentation, and we will get going. Let's see. Okay, is that working? Thumbs up if, okay. So our contact information is here, and after we'll make this available to Maine Parent Federation so they can put it on their website. It wasn't conjured into being until about 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock this morning, so I want to take another run through it before it gets posted permanently. We may need to make some edits, but Ben and I's contact information is there. If you have just general questions, then you can reach out to us. But if you're seeking specific legal advice for a specific child or seeking representation, then call these general numbers and ask for an intake appointment. And those are happening over the phone. But if it's a general question or you're a case manager or service provider, you can contact us directly. Just the arc of the presentation, Ben's going to start, and we're going to talk a little bit about where are we now, what are people saying. The short answer is all over the map. It depends on where you live and what classroom you're in to some degree. And then we're going to really walk through a guidance document that we put out last week. And then to the extent we haven't answered your questions along the way, we'll have time at the end for questions. So with that, I will, Ben, just holler if I'm not advancing things fast enough, but take it away.
Okay. I finally get to yell at Atlee. I've been waiting for this. So thanks everybody. I'm Ben, as Atlee and Carrie said, and thanks to Carrie for putting this together. It's great to connect with everybody. People might have Zoom fatigue, but we're hoping to keep this pithy and interesting. So please jump in. So like Atlee was saying, we sent out a survey. It was, I believe, about 2 weeks ago that we initiated it. And we got somewhere under 50 people, 40 to 50 people responded. And they are very much in line with the survey responses from Maine Parent Federation. So I think you'll get to see kind of a group result of that, like a public forum of that at some point.
Ben,
so yeah.
Can I just, you're probably going to cover this, but I just want to, because it's a general question that we've been getting at NPF, and I'm sure you have been getting, but a quick question came up, and I'm just going to put it in your brain as you continue to talk through, but somebody says their school is only providing packets. Their daughter's not capable of working through this and on her own and needs direct instruction. She normally has a one-on-one, but is receiving no special education right now. The school said they're closed. Providing packets to all students, including those as grades, sounds open to me. What is their legal responsibility? Can they be required to provide synchronous online services?
That's a great question. We're going to try to touch on that in the guidance section. So that'll come up in maybe about 15, 20 minutes. So if you don't mind, Carrie, just putting a pin in it for them. Yep. But yeah, there's a few different things to say about that. So let me just go over just what we're seeing, you know, across what we're hearing rather from across the state. And in yellow at the top, this is the question that went out. So what level of contact have you had from school? So it sounds like from one of the participants, that's a big concern. So we send emails back and forth, as well as his teachers talking with my child, 30 minutes each day. We have a daily hour-long Zoom with special ed teacher, 3 days a week, 30-minute Google Hangout. So some of these things are highlights of good contact. We don't really have a good measure of what's good and bad. It's all relative at this point. But we heard from both ends of the spectrum, obviously. More commentary about what they're hearing from their school. So some people are hearing a lot, very high level. Some say it's been great. Life skills class comment about meeting daily, and speech and OT are coming to the class meetings. So I guess to do with the question that we've already had, it sounds like it's at least feasible for some schools to be able to integrate the classroom Zoom time with some related services. You can keep going, Atlee. This is still on contact that people have had with schools. Some folks have said none. And so as we heard at the top from Atlee, there was another survey that went out as well to parents, and 17% of the people that responded said that they hadn't heard anything either from schools or from CDS. And as you'll hear in our guidance, we think that at a very basic level is completely inappropriate and should be addressed. Other comments, my son's special ed teacher has had 2 face-to-face Google chats with my son in 6 weeks. Both lasted maybe 30 minutes. Neither included any academic instruction. So folks seeing a mix of some related services, but no real academic. And another person saying they've had 0 contact. So we haven't, throughout the presentation, we haven't named names, you know, in terms of districts. We did get some of that information, and the little I'll say about that is that it is all over the map in terms of what kids are getting, but also in terms of where we heard from folks. So big districts, small districts, rural, urban, it doesn't seem to be going great or particularly bad in one particular region so far from what we heard. More on the level of contact that families have heard from schools. Someone said regular contact by email, text, and video uploads to the Google Classroom. Been attempted, but just don't work with my son's needs. So access sounds like an issue there. No direct contact. They've been out of school for 2 months. So big red flag. No direct contact. We receive emails weekly, and we have been sent worksheets to do at home. She is making a website for interaction with online links. So as I said, we got these responses over the last 2 weeks. And so this is after that first time period when I guess that would have been already probably 6 weeks or a month of time where schools were figuring out what to do, ramping up for remote learning. And this hopefully is a better picture of what schools have settled into in, whether good or bad. This is on to another question. So please describe educational services that are currently being provided. And some folks said they got packets. Some folks said Google Classroom, speech therapy worksheets, PT emails with videos, special ed classrooms are suggested links, email, Google Classroom, links to possible activities, no direct instruction, no attempt to meet the goals in the IEP, and none. So just a quick note on, we also reached out to a lot of our current clients and some past clients to survey as well beyond what we're showing here. And this was a theme that we heard, which was there is some stuff that's going out from the school, but we don't know what to do with it. We've got links, we have a website, there's some kind of check-in, but what should we do for a plan? No real structure to it. So that's another theme we saw. More responses from our survey to describe what the educational services are being provided. It's basically been left up to us to provide everything. I work full-time from home. We're doing our best, but we're struggling. We don't feel like the school is meeting our son's needs. The teacher provided worksheet packets. Me, it's all on me. So, a lot of pressure on families to provide education. And sounds like some highlights of things going well, but again, all over the map. So Atlee's going to go through now a bit on our guidance. So hopefully this will have some answers to your questions, but also lots of gray.
So the way that the guidance document is set up, and there's information about how to access it here. If you go to the DRME website, there's a red button that's a COVID-19 button, and that has all agency-wide kind of information that we've been putting out there and resources, and you can find it there. It was set up in a question and answer format, and so I think what we'll do is just go through it question by question, and then pause for some discussion, after that, after each question. What you're going to see on the screen is a very reduced version of it. So going to the document itself is something that would probably be helpful. First one, and we've touched on this. I haven't had much contact with my child's teachers or others in the school. Is this okay? No, it's not okay. We are very cognizant of the fact that everyone, teachers included, are juggling a lot of things right now, and many people are trying to work from home full time and also manage the instruction and supporting their children. But the fact is that school staff are working full time right now. And so if you haven't heard from your child's school by now, that is not okay. And the Department of Education doesn't think it's okay. And their guidance talks about how it's vital, that consistent communication and documentation with parents is vital in ensuring that people are collaborating as a team. So if you haven't heard, then you should contact the administration at the school. And if they don't help you resolve it, you should contact their boss. And at this point, it's something you should feel free to reach out to us for an intake about if you haven't heard anything. Also, if there are just communication issues and you may want to, and we'll be talking about this at various points throughout, you may want to make a written request for an IEP team meeting so the team can work together and solve a problem. Some students with disabilities are going to be, and our survey bore this out, some families are doing okay. Most of them are struggling with this, but some kids are doing okay. So not every IEP team needs to meet to talk about how to address this disruption. But some teams, when kids are struggling, really do. And so if there are communication issues, making a written request for an IEP meeting would be good. So I think I just accidentally advanced beyond that. So I'm going to pause there before we go on to the next question. Are there any questions about just communication in general? We're going to touch on services and core services in a bit, but communication in general, anybody want to share anything or have a question about that?
Other than that first question about the school saying they're closed, but students are getting grades and packets. So
Okay.
sounds like they're open to her. So that's a kind of a communication.
Okay.
Another one from our friend Deb, if there was an IEP meeting already scheduled to happen during the school closure, should the district reach out about that meeting? So we're having questions pop up now. So that's the first one.
Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about IEP meetings, but the short answer is that schools should not be having a policy of that we don't have meetings. We've heard a couple districts that are doing that. I participated in a Zoom IEP meeting, and I was actually really surprised by how well it went, and how efficient it was, and how we had a lot of the related services providers there that often don't all make it to the same meeting. So it definitely can be done. And if there was an already scheduled meeting, yeah, I mean, ideally they would just keep that meeting and transfer it to a Zoom platform or some other platform if that worked for the family. But if the school needs to change it, they should reach out about changing it and schedule it at a mutually agreeable time. The school, it's totally fine to even ask the parent, do you want to wait and have this until we come back? And there's no need to meet for the sake of meeting. But if there are issues, I would encourage families to request and to seek an IEP meeting. We'll talk about kind of what if a school says no, what do they have to do when you ask for that? It's a whole question in the Q&A.
So the next question is, I'm a case manager. A parent is requesting an IEP, but the school is refusing. Now what?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm happy to answer it now. We may, when we get to by the time we get to all these other questions, we may have gone through all of it, but that's totally fine. When you make a request of a school, with regard to the special education needs of a student, or to have an IEP meeting or anything like that, it's okay for schools to say no, but they need to issue a written notice that explains why they're saying no. So if they're saying no, and the only explanation is because it's our policy during the COVID-19 educational disruption that we don't have any IEP meetings for any reason, I believe that that's not going to be legally defensible. So if there's no written notice that's been issued, I would encourage the family to ask again. And if they still say no and don't issue a written notice, then I think you just file a complaint with the Department of Education. That's a very short, simple complaint that says, my child needs an IEP meeting for X, Y, and Z reasons. We've asked the school and they said no. We asked them for a written notice and they refused. And we're filing this complaint to resolve this. But I think this is a time to do everything you can to try and work with the schools. But also, at a certain point, when they're not working with you on something like that, then just file a complaint and let the department sort it out and somebody investigate it. I think in all areas, it's an individualized assessment and determination. And so when schools start applying blanket policies, they're going to likely run into trouble. So that's what I would have to say about that. So this is a big one, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton of questions about this. Is the school required to follow the IEP during this disruption? Well, yes, but, and the but is very large, right? The context that we're in right now is that all in-person instruction has been suspended. So can any IEP be implemented as written? It's going to be the rare one, right? And it's going to be kids that were already in some sort of online type of environment. So yes, the IEPs are still in effect. They still reflect what kids need, but they're not going to be implemented as written. And so what is DOE saying about this? And it's fairly consistent with what the federal government's saying about this. And it's a bit of a pragmatic approach, but it's not going to be real satisfactory to hear, is what do you have to do? You have to ensure that each student is provided the special education and related services sufficient to meet the intent of their IEP to the greatest extent possible in light of the suspended classroom instruction. What does that mean? I don't know. It's going to mean something different for every student, but I think it's going to mean more than packets. I think it's going to mean more than just what is everybody else getting. It means that they have an individualized education program, and we need to be working to implement it to the greatest extent possible, but everybody has to recognize that we're not going to be in the same room. And so it's again, there's not a lot of black and white, but the greatest extent possible is the guidance from the state. And so if all you're getting is every 2 weeks a set of photocopies that seem like somebody printed them off from the website on Sunday afternoon, and nobody even wants them back, and there's no feedback loop on like what they're doing, and it seems disconnected to the curriculum, that doesn't seem like to the greatest extent possible to me. And so it's going to be, again, an individualized determination.
Atlee,
yeah, go ahead.
I have a quick question. If a school is offering virtual learning, they have to provide the technology to access that virtual learning. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, so if they're offering something and you can't access it, then they're not really offering it, right? There are a lot of tech-related issues. I understand the Department of Ed is really working to address those, and they're providing essentially the way that they want it to go is that you contact the principal at your child's school and say, here are the difficulties. We don't have access to internet. We don't have access to computer. We don't have the ability to access the online instruction. And then what I understand DOE is doing is connecting those schools with Wi-Fi enabled tablets for those students that need them. I don't know exactly like how far we are in that. I know that it's a difficult time to get computers. If any of you have tried to purchase computers or webcams or beard trimmers or soon pressure canners or things, I mean, it's difficult to get things. So I think there's some bottlenecks about getting it, but the idea is to connect through the school principal, and like a lot of other things, make record of it, put it in writing, explain what the difficulties are, and ask for them to help solve that major problem. But in the interim, they should be working to solve how do they provide that information another way, right? Are you going to just have an old-fashioned phone call to discuss the work that's being given? Like, again, individualized, how do you solve that problem in another way? So I also understand that if you go to the DD Council's website, they have a program where you can access technology through their website, where they also have some tablets that are available for families. So
yes, they do. It hasn't been widely advertised because they do have a limited amount, but
no.
I'll share the link. I just looked it up for a participant. I will share the link right now.
Okay. Well, I didn't. Sorry, I said that out loud, I guess.
No, it's okay. I mean, they just asked us not to put it up on our social media sites. I think for our audience here today, it's fine.
Okay.
So I shared the link twice by accident to just one of the participants. I'll share it now to all of you.
Okay.
I'll also share the link in the chat box to DRM's COVID-19 resource sheet in a moment as well. That's it, Atlee. Right now for questions, I see a couple more popping up that I'll take a look.
Okay, thanks. And just to loop back and underscore, the delivery of special education and related services, just like it was before, should continue to be based on the individual needs of each student. So while students with disabilities should have access to everything that everybody is getting in the school, they should also have an individualized approach. And that's going to be part and parcel to giving them access to what's going on. So if your child's having significant difficulties, again, consider requesting an IEP meeting, put it in writing, try and work with the team to address the concerns. And Ben, I forget where we're breaking. We're going to break at 23. Is that? Yep. Okay. So this one's really important. If the school is asking you to agree to change the IEP to reflect the services that they're able to provide during this time, just say no to that. It's important to ensure that the IEP reflects the specialized instruction, the related service, the supplementary aids and services, and all that a student needs. And if you remove services from the IEP, then that becomes the status quo, and you may have to in the future fight to restore those services to the IEP. So it is perfectly fine for the team to meet and have a discussion and say, for example, we believe that the IEP reflects what this child needs, but here in this educational disruption period is how we're going to deliver services. That is a very different thing. And then capturing that in a written notice, that's a very different thing than saying we're going to amend the IEP to reflect this reduced level of service during this time. So I can't really think of a good reason to amend the IEP down to what schools are able to provide right now. And I think some schools were saying it maybe from a good place or from a fear of, they wanted the paperwork to all be, correct and all of that. But the importance of keeping the IEP as reflective of the needs is because that's the status quo, that's the stay put IEP, and you don't want to have to fight to restore those services later. There will be some services a school just can't provide during this time, but that doesn't mean we take them out of the IEP.
Atlee,
yes.
Somebody might have this question, but what about if the team wants to meet and the school is proposing to change the IEP, but it's going to be limited to time? So if the school says during the COVID disruption, the IEP is going to look like this, and then it ends, is that okay?
It's less bad. When things are really time limited, you just set the criteria, and when in-person instruction returns, then all these previous services are in the IEP. I mean, that's essentially kind of, what you'd be doing if you documented it in the written notice. I just think keeping the document as reflective of what the student actually needs could be certainly important if there are disputes down the road. So, but certainly if something's time limited under the way that the law has been interpreted in Maine, at least in the First Circuit, is like temporary agreements to change the IEP don't change the stay put or the status quo, but you just want to be careful about that. And I think everybody can get their needs, met if it's documented in a written notice that, look, we've all discussed this. Johnny still needs all this stuff. We can't provide a couple of these things, and we'll be meeting in September to talk about how to support him in returning to school once we can provide them. And we'll talk about kind of the compensatory services and things like that. And just maybe it's next question actually. So
can I pause you guys for a minute because we've got some questions piling up. So. I've got one that says, so a child on my caseload needs a speech eval to determine eligibility, but school saying that they cannot be evaluated over Zoom and it has to be done in person, so it can't be done. What do I do?
And so that's for initial eligibility. Do we know?
I don't know if it's for initial eligibility or if it's for speech eligibility, but Diane, if you wanted to.
Yeah, maybe if there's just a little bit more clarification, like is it a situation where a student's already receiving service and this is to inform maybe the need for additional service? My answer might be slightly different.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to allow Diane to talk real quick.
Okay.
I'm going to unmute you, Diane.
Oh, lucky me.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, it would be for an initial IEP meeting. This child was recently referred and has, according to teacher and parents, severe speech and language delays, and we're being told that we cannot do speech and language evaluations via Zoom other than RTIC.
Okay, got it. Thank you. It's a tough one. I think evaluation timelines and things, even though they weren't waived, and we'll get to the waivers in a bit, it is going to be, there are certain things that are just really hard to do except in person. That said, there are a lot of school districts that utilize telehealth speech. And so there are a lot of districts that actually do online speech assessments. So I think what I would consider doing is making a request for the school to explore using one of the other telehealth. There are multiple districts in Maine that use only have telehealth speech, except for like, you know, certain circumstances, but that's their go-to. And I certainly have had clients that have been evaluated that way. It's imperfect, you know, I think, but they may just need to look out, you know, at who else to contract with. It's a little bit tricky when, you know, you're not eligible yet. I think there would be other avenues if you're already eligible for services, already have an IEP team, and maybe there's some outside information that comes in, having the team consider that and provide some supports and services, you know, even though they haven't done their own full eval, would be something that's definitely within the purview of an IEP team. Since the question is about a student who's not yet eligible, the other thing you might think about is to request potentially a 504 team meeting, seeing if the school could provide some services through a 504 plan in that way. But for kids that are not yet eligible, I think that there will kind of be inevitably some delays in some circumstances because of the very real difficulties with conducting evaluations in our current situation.
I would just add too.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I would just add too that there could be seemingly outdated evaluation, but perhaps there's enough there that the team can meet and review. Maybe it's 3 years old, maybe it's from CDS and the kiddo qualified at one point and now doesn't qualify for services. I think sometimes there's enough information already there to act on, so you could push the issue a little bit.
Teresa's asking, what about changing the IEP for ESS?
So we didn't address in this guidance extended school year, partly because the world is just evolving so quickly, but my guess is we're going to have some detailed extended school year guidance out in the next couple of weeks. It's just a day is kind of like a month these days as far as how quick things are changing. I'm going to give you just a little bit of, you know, information that at least how I understand that the Department of Ed is approaching this is that they are working to try and establish a framework and benchmarks for how it would be safe for schools to have in-person summer programming. But that's all very fluid right now. And I think that where they're thinking is making sure that that the programs that maybe serve students with the most significant needs, who maybe have had the most difficulty accessing instruction in the environment since March, that those types of programs, if they meet certain safety protocols and the community spread, and I mean, they're taking their cues from Maine CDC, which is, I think, very appropriate. But they are working, they don't have them yet, but they are working on some protocols for what does extended school year look like. That's just for in-person. I mean, extended school year is going to happen, but it's a question of whether it's going to be remote or not. And if a student has had extended school year historically in their IEP, but it hasn't been determined yet this year, I think that I would just be approaching it with the expectation that they would have extended school year this year. And I know that most schools are thinking about expanding those offerings, not reducing them. And so if the IEP team needs to meet to discuss ESY, then by all means, you know, request a meeting to talk about it, and amending it to include it if it hasn't included it in the past could be appropriate. So I think more to come on what summer looks like, and it's not going to be a linear progression. I mean, I think people, you know, the department's going to create some guidelines, and then local districts are going to make determinations on what they're going to do. And I'm pretty confident in saying that there will be some programs this summer, for at least some of the summer, that have some in-person instruction. How's that for an answer? And the rest of it will probably still be, you know, online. But I do believe in the next 2 weeks, there's going to be a lot more information from the state on this. And so we will, once there's enough for us to say, we'll put something in writing and get it out to folks. So
I could take a stab at this question just because I'm experiencing this personally with my daughter. For those of you that don't know, I have a 13-year-old, a 6th grader at Saco Middle School, Down syndrome, who has a full IEP. Somebody asked if school-based therapies are being delivered remotely via telepractice on Zoom. That is good. And I would say, just like anything else with special education, it's very individualized based on the child that you're working with and that you have at home. Something is always better than nothing, but if your child has an adverse reaction to having teletherapy and you're finding that that's more traumatic and causing more behaviors, then having access to telepractice probably isn't the best decision for your child. At home, we have been able to do both through public schools and through her private therapies, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and physical therapy, believe it or not, for our daughter. Granted, we've had to have the technology in place. We also have a treadmill at home, which allows us to do more for PT than maybe some families have at home. There are some days that are better than others. What has been helpful with school is inviting her ed tech to join in on the therapy appointments. So she has a visitor. So if ed techs are available, I know they're getting paid in most districts. I think all ed techs are currently getting paid through the end of the school year. So if they are available and you have telepractice, getting them set up to join in on the meeting through Google Hangout is possible. It really helps to alleviate all the instruction coming from just mom or dad. But like I said, it's specific to your individual needs and your child. So if you feel like it's working for your child and it's being offered, then use it. If you feel like it's not working for your child, then don't use it. And I think most districts are trying to do some sort of telepractice with therapies, but it is one of the areas where we're getting a lot of questions from families because it's been one of the harder areas for parents to access. I don't know if Ben or Atlee, you have any thing to add?
No, thanks for that.
So just to finish up this question before moving to the next, I've only heard this in a couple instances, so I'm hoping it's not really widespread. But there was at least a couple districts that were taking the approach initially that if the IEP was going to expire during this period, then they would just call the parents, ask them what their concerns are, issue a new IEP that had new annual dates, and not hold an IEP meeting. And that's not okay. It's not okay for a number of reasons, but the Department of Ed, I think, has signaled that they're going to be very flexible and with dates and things like that. And so what their guidance is, and I would endorse this, is that if there's not a reason for the team to meet, if everybody's, if we don't really need to come together, then it's fine to just continue the IEP as it is until in-person instruction resumes. And that's what their guidance that I have there at the bottom is. If it lapses, it's not going to go away. It's not stopping. It's just going to kind of carry on till schools have time to meet. I mean, if it's me and I'm a school, I'm holding the annual meetings as I would, because they're going to, if they wait to hold them all until everybody returns, then they're going to be holding IEP meetings all day, every day. And so I think it's a little short-sighted potentially to say you're not holding IEP meetings, even just from an administrative perspective. And you don't want to spend all of September having all the IEP meetings that you should have been having from March through August, right? So anyway, if that's happening, I don't think that should be happening, and the DOE's guidance has been pretty clear, and to the extent a school is worried they're going to get in trouble for it, I don't think they will. So Carrie, sorry I cut you off.
No, it's okay. What's your stance on schools operating from a no new learning perspective or approach? So you have goals on your IEP and they're going with the approach of we're just trying to prevent regression. We're not trying to advance goals. Is that something you feel, and I know it varies from district to district and it varies on obviously the individual's ability to access the distance learning, but if a district is coming across with a no new learning approach, thoughts?
My thoughts would be the same with any kind of blanket approach. And I think you answered your question kind of at the end of your question is that for some students, given the impact of this disruption, maintenance of skills would be an appropriate, you're not like really changing the goal. The goal is still, you want them to be where they are in a year, but you're hoping this is a time limited, disruption. They're having a real hard time with it, and so your focus is really on maintenance of skills. That's an individual determination that makes sense. And
I would add to that, what's really important for parents to remember too, and what we're trying to convey to parents is that yes, our special education kids are going to regress and at a faster rate than most other kids, but there isn't going to be a student across the nation who's been out of school for this length of time that doesn't socially or emotionally or academically regress in one area or another. So all of our students are regressing at this point in time. And we have to remember, we've never navigated anything like this before. You know, obviously it's, as Atlee said, it's individualized based on your student, and if your student's doing well and able to work towards goals and getting work provided to them, that's great. We do have to remember, though, that every single child is going to regress during this time.
Yeah, but and I agree, but at the same time, you know, if students are, you know, we should not be lowering expectations just to lower them across the board. And so,
right,
you know,
yes.
there are some students who, you know, are actually really enjoying this because, you know, there are ways in which this is kind of allowing them to, you know, have the space that they need. And, you know, so for kids that can, let's expect more. And for kids who are really being impacted by this, let's really focus on making sure that we don't slide backwards, you know. But it's just gonna, I know it's not satisfactory, but it has to be individualized for every kid. So
this is an interesting question, and I know there's been some talk around this at Maine DOE level, and I don't know if you guys have any other input, but for individuals who might be aging out this year and will graduate because they're reaching the age of 20, but haven't maybe received all of their credits because of the COVID-19, is there anything being talked about to be able to extend their learning for another year, even if they're reaching the age of 20?
I don't have anything to say on that right now, but
Yeah.
I think that's something that when we put out some ESY guidance, we'll try and address.
Yeah, I'd say the same, but those conversations are happening at Maine DOE.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, maybe not specifically. I want to be a little careful about that. If there are families that have real concerns about that, they can certainly contact us. It's going to be, there are different avenues that you could go, right? You could look at it as a compensatory measure. We're going to talk about kind of compensatory education and things. You know, I think the analysis for me, if a case like that came in the door, is going to really be to look at the totality of the transition services that have been provided over the last, you know, couple of years, and to determine if there's potentially a way to say that, you know, it's not really because of this disruption that you know, this child is not prepared for work, independent living, further education and training. This young, you know, not child. It's, you know, I call everybody a child, even though I work with people up to 21. But that's something I'm trying to break myself of. But the student is not ready for those transition activities. Could it be because the transition programming has been wholly inappropriate? And so that would probably be as an advocate and an attorney, that would be my first analysis. And it's a detailed, in-depth analysis. If it's just that everything was going perfect and everyone was happy, and just since March, you know, things, you know, this has caused problems since March, that's going to be a lot less strong of a case, and I don't know what's going to happen with it. But there very well may be some, you know, kids that are aging out this year where, you know, the real issue is the lack of appropriate transition planning, and not necessarily what happened from March, April, May. So.
And I sit on the IDA State Advisory Panel and had the opportunity to meet with Erin Fraser last Wednesday. And this was actually one of those specific areas where she did say conversations were happening at MDOE right now. Okay. But she did emphasize it will be on an individualized basis, that those type of decisions would be made. What about grade retention?
In general, I think that retention is a bad approach, and that unless it's a very young student, like kindergarten or first grade, or, you know, that the research shows that the negative impacts of retention are significant, and the benefits. To me, the solution is to provide more appropriate services going forward, not to retain a student. And students often don't get, even if our messages that we're trying to send are clear on that, they don't get that message. They get messages that they internalize very negatively when they're retained, and it causes social difficulties or exacerbates them. So in general, I don't think anybody should be retained because of what's happened since March. And I also think that teams should be very careful, just because of the research, about decisions about retention period. But if schools are basically, if a school is going to be retaining a student because that student hasn't engaged appropriately in their view in the distance learning, that's a case I would like. So you can send that, or, you know, if it's like if there's a fight about it and the school says, no, you haven't met the criteria because of what's happened March, April, May, that's something I'd be interested in trying to help work with a family on. Sometimes it's families that want to retain their children, and often when we work through that, the fear is just that they're going to fall further and further behind. But the remedy to that, to me, is not keeping them where they were. It didn't move the ball forward, but it's providing appropriate services going forward so they can access the general ed curriculum.
So what if they're transitioning though, Atlee, to a different school? So say we have like a K-2 going to 3 to 5 school, or somebody transitioning from middle school, from elementary to middle school to high school. Would you still offer that same advice with those transitions, with where you're looking at a completely different staff working with your child?
Yeah, my retention advice is fairly consistent.
Okay.
And, it's just because you know, everything's individualized. I mean, there may be really good reasons to do it, but I think people should be very clear-eyed about the fact that the research shows that it can have significant negative impacts. And so you don't just do it because you're afraid. Do it because there are affirmative reasons why that's the best thing for that particular child at that particular time. I don't know.
And I can add from a personal standpoint, this school actually recommended that my daughter do retention for her first grade year. So we went along with them and we did it. And it was by far the worst year of schooling she ever received. And she regressed in every single academic area. So it wasn't the right choice for us to make at that point in time, but we learned from it. And so that was what Atlee is describing. That was our personal experience. If special education teachers are offering individual meetings and the family does not show up for them, does that meet the requirements of trying to meet the IEP?
Well, I'd need more, but I guess and sorry, Ben, I'm just jumping in here. So if you want to.
Okay, it's your slide.
Okay.
Sorry, they're coming in fast and furious.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So it would depend, right? It depends on why the family's not accessing them. I've spoken with, some families, and I might've mentioned, I'm sorry, this is my second training today. So sometimes I'm like, did I say this already? It's possible that I did. But I've spoken with some families who've just made the determination that the services being offered are just too disruptive to the schedule that they're trying to create, as they just try and kind of hold on and hang on and survive this. And so they've just said, we just can't participate in these things because it's escalating. It's not regular enough. Can't build it into my schedule. And so for those families, I'm telling them, you should have an IEP meeting. You should talk about what are the alternatives, but at the end of the day, don't do things that are like harming your family structure at home during this. Nobody should be penalized for what they are doing or not doing. No family should be, if what's being offered is not meeting their needs. But ideally, you'd have an IEP, and they would discuss like, why is this? Is it because it's at a bad time? Do you not have the technology? Problem solving it first. But it's never a situation, whether we're in a crisis or not. IEP teams can't take the approach in any situation where, well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Like, we put it out there. The fact that a family's not accessing it or a student's not accessing it, that's a problem for the IEP team to solve. So you don't get credit for just like putting something out there and then saying like, take it or leave it. That's not how individualized programming works. But does that help?
You're gonna hit upon compensatory services within the.
Like the next slide. Yeah. So
okay. Why don't you go to the next slide, and I'll still, because that'll answer one of our questions, and I'll keep thumbing through the ones that we have.
Okay. And this slide has been sitting in everybody's face for 10 minutes, and I think we covered it beforehand, but it should be an individualized determination, whether you hold an IEP meeting or not. And both families and schools may just decide it's not worth it. Let's wait until next year. But if there's something going on, like a meeting is necessary, then the school should hold it. And if they don't, they have to issue a written notice explaining why. I want to give one example of something, maybe folks aren't thinking of, but I encourage you to, especially for families that are really struggling with Now you're not just doing whatever job you were doing, and you're not just the parent, you're also the teacher. And so it's possible that for some students, the IEP team might need to come together and talk about what sort of parent counseling and training is a related service listed under the IDEA. So does the parent need some support from the social worker, from the BCBA, from the special education teacher, from the speech provider? Do they need support in assisting their child in accessing the services that are being provided in the way that they're being provided? And that could be added in as like half an hour a week of a call with whatever certain professional, so that the parent is getting some support. Because there are a lot of these things that are going home that are not, it's not just intuitive what you're supposed to do with them, and families need some support. Some of that should just be happening as general explanation, but for some students who have really, particularized needs, and the family needs help understanding how those, adaptations and all that stuff was going on, they can't be expected to just do it. So you may want to have an IEP meeting to talk about that. So this is Comp Ed and that whole discussion. And this is a really complicated and evolving situation, but I'm fortunate that we're doing this today, because I had a conversation yesterday that helped really, it provided a framework, and I think there's a word that you're going to start hearing that I'll provide now, but I think you're going to start hearing it from schools, and you're going to start hearing it from the state. And so I'm going to advance forward a slide and then go back. Is COVID impact services as opposed to compensatory education. I don't know if you'll start hearing this word, but this is kind of how we're thinking about it and encouraging people to think about it. What can you expect going back? You can expect an individualized determination by the IEP team about the services that might be needed once in-person instruction activities resume. That's going to look different for everybody. I don't think you can expect, and I don't think it's beneficial to take the approach that I missed 60 hours of direct reading instruction. I missed 40 hours of speech, whatever. So you owe me that. I don't think that's going to be that's not the approach we're encouraging people to take. We're encouraging people to take a real individualized approach. And DOE is kind of, this is what they're saying at the bottom of the slide. If you're unable to receive services for this extended period of time, then you need an individualized determination about what compensatory services are needed. I think you're going to see DOE and others start to talk about these things more as COVID impact services, and I'll get to why in a second. But the idea is that some students are going to need a lot. Some students are really going to need really detailed planning, coordination of supports. They're going to have new needs. They're going to have all kinds of needs that need to be addressed just to get ready to walk back into a school building. There's going to be other students who may not need much more than the equal access to like the whole school approaches that I hope schools are going to be developing for when in-person activities return. There's hopefully going to be a whole lot of really great whole school social emotional learning going on when kids are back. Because everybody is going to need some of that. I don't think any school that starts September off, if we return in September or whenever we return, starts it off with reading, writing, and math, for that first month. That's going to be a poor approach, because all their students have kind of experienced this kind of collective trauma in some way. It's going to impact some kids a lot more than others, but hopefully, for a lot of kids with disabilities, just participating in some good whole school approaches to getting them back into school is going to be enough. For some kids, that's not going to come close to being enough. And so it's just an individualized approach. And it's not really going to be related, I don't think, or highly correlated to the services that they missed before. So some kids that maybe missed a ton of services are going to need less to get them ready to go to school. Some kids that really had great services during this time, the school really was objectively doing the best they could do. They still will have regressed significantly and been significantly harmed by this. So I think the reason folks nationally, the technical assistance centers and things that are supporting states are talking about COVID impact services versus Comp Ed is that compensatory education has this like level of I did something wrong. And there's going to be situations where schools didn't really do anything wrong necessarily, but the children were still significantly negatively impacted by this in ways that are going to significantly impact their ability to access the general ed curriculum and make progress toward their IEP goals. So it's a problem for the team to solve. So they were impacted significantly by this disruption, and we solve it. So there's less of the kind of blaming and the, you violated my kid's rights, or you failed to provide X, Y, and Z, and more just what do we need to move forward together, the comp ed piece, there are schools though. Yeah, just can I finish this one piece and then
sorry, go ahead. Yep, absolutely.
There are schools that are dropping the ball, right? The schools that haven't been in touch with anybody, those families have, I think, compensatory education claims. They can be framed as such, right? The schools that haven't been trying to implement the services at all on the IEP and haven't been in touch about that. So there is going to be a place, I think, for those types of discussions. But in our office, I think we're really going to push for most things to just be like, look, we have a problem now, IEP team. We have a problem, and we have to solve it together. And how are we going to address the negative impacts of this disruption on this student's education? This is just the last one, and then I know there'll be a ton of questions and discussion about this. And I touched on this, but there are also going to be new needs. So some students are going to come back with needs that didn't exist at all in March, and the team has to address those as well. And those are things that the IEP team should discuss. So I just think all these things kind of get discussed kind of as a piece, but at least right now, for most districts, I'm encouraging families to think of it as just like don't do the counting and the math, and be keeping track of what you're doing. And we'll talk about this, what your child's receiving. But in the end, it's going to be back to where all the discussions should be in these things. And that's about, what does my child need to get back into school and to get back on track. So sorry, that's it for that slide. And I think after this, I'm turning it over to Ben. So whatever
Okay,
question.
so I'll put this question out to both of you, just going back to ESY a little bit. ESY typically means that your child's receiving percentage-wise less instruction than they get during regular school hours. Do you think because we're getting a percentage less right now because we're out of school, that it would be even less than they will be getting if we go into ESY?
I think that a lot of schools are going to beef up their ESY programming rather than reduce it. But I don't know. I think it's going to vary across the state. I think some schools are like, they've turned the corner now after the break. They're headed for the barn. They're going to close up shop early. And everybody's thinking like, we'll get ready for September. But I think others, in recognition of the impact, especially the students who typically get ESY just as a matter of course, are the students who've likely been significantly impacted by this. And so I think directors realize that, and they know that if they don't provide services continuing over the summer, they're going to have even bigger problems, just as far as getting everybody back in the swing of things. So that's my guess. I'm basing that off much. I don't know, Ben, do you have thoughts on that?
I think too, there just might be quite a bit of general curriculum over the summer. And so if they've got a structure set up for ESY, and that would typically be targeted towards those kids that have it in their IEP and that they need it, those might be just available to a broader array of kids generally. So, and this will be another month later of schools getting into the mode of distance learning. So it could be very robust. Again, it might be all over the map. It might be different everywhere you go, but I would be hopeful that it could be pretty decent time.
Could we just rewind a little bit more back to the very first question, which was, what is the school's legal responsibility when it appears they're providing distant learning packages to some students, but this mom is being told that the school is closed?
Oh, okay. So I didn't catch that initially.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was it was before we even got into it. And so I just wanted to backtrack and make sure we get that one answered.
So the school is open for kids without disabilities, but closed for a child with
so they're telling this mom that the school is closed, but she sees that there are distance learning packages being sent out and that grading is still ongoing. So, they're telling her that they're closed and not providing her anything, but she has seen others receive information and sees that grading is still ongoing.
Yeah, so that's troubling, and she could certainly reach out to our office and ask for an intake appointment. I mean, at
Okay.
the very least in all this, one thing I can say with certainty, even though I've told you there's a lot of gray, is that students with disabilities must have access to the general things that everybody else is getting. And there's
Yeah,
just
she says that they've been requesting Zoom sessions, but they're refusing.
yeah, I'd have to get into the details, but just broad, and do that individually. But broadly, if students without disabilities are having access to something, then students with disabilities have to have access to that, and so that's troubling. If it can't be, we could close. You can close the school for everybody, but you can't close it just for students with disabilities. You run afoul of every civil rights law that we have on the books, right? So.
Yeah. Okay. So what is the guidance out for special education teachers or teachers that are trying to reach out to families but aren't getting them to respond?
For teachers?
Yeah. So I'm a related service provider, social worker services for elementary, middle school, and many families are declining my direct support. What guidance do you have for this situation?
I would say, try a different way. Maybe try differently, not harder. And try and get, or maybe ask somebody else to make the approach. It's going to be individual. I don't know why, families aren't doing that. I can tell you, even in our own house, there's a lot of times when, there are multiple people on Zoom calls at the same time. It may just be that it's not the right time. It's not working, or the family's just in crisis mode. But I am really worried about students who've had no contact. And so there could be all kinds of good reasons why the family can't do that, or the family could be just in significant crisis and in need of some real significant support. So I would say that you have to try differently. And I hope, and I know some schools are doing this and some districts are doing this, but really that type of stuff is being tracked, and that there's a plan in place and you're getting support as a teacher to how to make sure that you've been connected with all your families. I mean, are those families, were they on, receiving free and reduced lunch? Are they still accessing meals? Just figuring out all the points of contact, and just making sure that it exists. It might just be what's being offered just doesn't work for that family at that time, or again, like really the social.
And if you're a contracted worker with a school department, like a licensed clinical social worker, I would check in with the district to see what their policies are, because I know a lot of districts have put in place policies around this specific situation. Families are extremely overwhelmed. And so, part of the reason they might not be reaching out is it's just too much for them. But I would say keep trying, check in with your district about what their policies are. I know, for example, in our district here in Saco, if they have not heard back from a family and the family's on receiving meals, they're sending a written notice out with the meals, asking if they're okay, if they need anything, and to please just get in touch and let them know. If they still haven't heard back, they're actually referring it to the resource officer to do a well check, just to make sure that everybody is safe at the very least. So check in with your district. I know a lot of districts are putting in policies like that. Do you guys have any sort of input on a backlog that will face both with evaluations and with IEPs when we get back into school?
Just how will we approach, how will schools approach
just the approach and how parents should approach if they're being told, we can't meet the 45 days because we have a backlog.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of it's going to be making sure there's a meeting on the books for when folks are able to get together for, to review any outstanding evaluations or if there's any missing pieces. But I think that's just a natural part of it. There's going to be a big backlog of evaluations. I know that you touched on it a little bit earlier. There is some flexibility for certain professionals to be able to do tele-evaluations and observations, but some of them haven't been given the green light to be able to have that be normed and appropriate as an evaluation. So I think it's just going to be part of things when get back. Yeah.
But I do want to make a distinction between, I think, not meeting the timelines now while we're in a state of emergency and this disruption. That's something that I think is a general state of affairs. When students are all back, those timelines are still real, and so that the schools are going to need to figure out how to meet them. And my concern would be, They just need to figure out how to meet them. Sometimes, I mean, there's all kinds of ways, right, that those things get slow walked. You know, the family will request an evaluation and they'll say, oh, we can meet in a month to talk about it. You know, we can talk with individual families about those sorts of things. But I think the deadlines, when you come back, the eval deadlines are still, you know, are still real. And there's going to be some resource issues, certainly. But
That's a
right
good,
now, nobody's, you know, the timelines are going to are flexible, I think, right now, because just as Ben said, there's certain things that just can't happen, you know, part of the evals.
Yeah.
And the fidelity of doing evals telehealth wise sometimes aren't great. So you really don't want to have your child evaluate on some of these assessments done through a telehealth, because the fidelity and then the eligibility criteria could become skewed, and you want to make sure that you're getting a correct assessment of your child and that they have a fair chance for eligibility. I have a very specific question. Melinda says, if I have withdrawn my child from school when he was 17 and he was doing adult ed until this hit, is it possible from a legal standpoint to register him next fall for high school with an IEP? Online is not working for him at all this year. Would have been his normal senior year. He turned 18 in January.
Yeah,
that's tricky.
If you haven't graduated with a regular high school diploma or reached the age of the end of the year in which you turn 20, then you can still be eligible for services. I don't want to get too far into the details, but depending on, it may be possible, it may be that the student would have to be reevaluated and all that process would have to go through. But there's nothing that would prevent the enrollment as far as I understood the question. And I wouldn't feel comfortable getting too much more into. It's pretty detailed. So, but yeah, regular high school diploma or the end of the year in which you've turned 20 is when your IDEA eligibility ends in Maine right now. And doesn't sound like either of those two things have happened. It just might be that there's some hurdles, you know, that have to be addressed.
What would be reasonably appropriate for a school to provide right now to a blind or deaf children or deaf-blind child?
I would just say it's very much the same as for all kids. So they should have access to free appropriate public education. They should have access to everything other kids are getting. Again, like Atlee's highlighted, the IEP is going to look different. And I think a big highlight for those types of disabilities is going to be technology and access. So was there something that kiddos were able to use while they're in the classroom that they don't happen to have at home? I would expect those to be at home, you know, and if it's not happening, that should be a team meeting and say, well, you used to have a certain hearing device at school and that's not at home, then that's an issue of access. So I would say they should be getting the same as all other kids. I don't know if you have anything else.
And to add to that, there may be circumstances. I mean, there are students receiving educational services right now in person. Most of them are in residential settings. And there may be a circumstance where there's just that what people need to figure out how to do is to safely provide in-person support, right? Because there are youth that are getting in-home services and other things. So if a child's, the nature of a child's disability is such that there's no way they can derive any benefit from the online kind of instruction being offered, then the team should do exactly what Ben said and talk about solving that problem. And if that involves having some contact with that student, then figuring out what are the protocols for doing that safely and within the guidelines. And, you know, I can't really answer, I don't know, but if there's only one way to do it, and that is to have some in-person instruction, then that probably needs to happen. Or there's a very clear, explicit discussion about like how we're going to provide compensatory education. Because, you know, that would be a situation where, again, the nature of the child's disability was such that they couldn't access it at all. And so if we're not going to provide it now, we have to provide it later. So
in the follow-up was that, that's just to answer your question, Atlee, that the school has refused to provide any in-person in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so,
I it's going to be so detailed, but that's a case where if the family wanted to reach out and ask for an intake appointment, it's something we could think about on a, you know, on a more detailed level.
And so now the opposite, what if a child is actually doing really, really well with virtual learning right now, better than they do with the in-person instruction? So when we return back to school, what would you recommend parents to do if they feel like virtual learning is working better for their child?
I would say that's one of the silver linings is there's a whole nother mode of learning that kids are experiencing that wouldn't have been tried out. I would certainly be just concerned about access to peers, and that social aspect. But it sounds like now there's a whole new tool, a whole new thing for the team to talk about that say, well, you had asked about this years ago and we said we didn't have any remote things. Now there's really no excuse. They know all about remote. So I think it opens up some new possibilities.
Again, this was a topic that was discussed at my meeting last week with Erin Fraser present, and she said basically the same thing you're saying, Ben, is those children who are actually excelling right now, this now shows that school districts can do it this way for them if it shows to be in their best interest in their least restrictive environment.
Yeah.
What if parents are unable to engage, or unable to keep up, or even because we're so overwhelmed having multiple children at home, some are essential workers and they're not able to do the instruction? Are they going to be punished for not being able to complete assignments or do any instruction at all by the district when they return?
It's a good question. A lot of this is going to be that district-based district control, how they decide how to do grades, if that's what they mean by punishment. And I know at least there was guidance from Department of Education last week, I think it was, which was please be forgiving with whatever you decide to do for accountability to do with grades. I know attendance is largely just waived in terms of the accountability in that sense, but in terms of grading, I know the hope is that districts will be forgiving. And
in a best practice, if you're a parent in the situation, is to be communicating with the district and saying we're doing the best we can and we're just not able to complete this assignment, or I just can't do this right now, but still make an effort to communicate with the district at least once a week as to what's going on at home and what you are doing, because they might be able to pull some of the things that you are doing from that information to learn about just what the child's life has been like, so that when you do return back to school and you're trying to determine a new present level of performance, it could help them to access a better IEP for your child. So it's one thing to not be able to do the education and the instruction. We understand that, but don't stop the communication with the district. Best practice is just keep communicating and telling them what is going on in your home. Nobody should be penalized for not being able to do instruction at home, but when you stop communicating, that's when people get concerned and worried, and not that you should be penalized. It just might help you in the best way possible to get a present level of performance when your child does return back to school. Yeah. This should get us caught up with questions during school closure. If a family is getting help from others, grandparents, etc., to enable the student to access the available learning, should the family document this as a mitigating measure? I'm worried this makes it more challenging to show what the child needs to access their education.
Okay, I guess I missed the thread a little bit. So there's things that are happening that aren't being recorded as.
So no, she's saying that she's during the school closure, if a family is getting help from others like grandparents, etc., to enable the student to access the available learning, should the family document this as a mitigating measure? I'm worried this makes it more challenging to show what the child needs to access their education. So
I see. Yep.
Yeah, they need additional help in order for their child to be able to access the education.
In general, I think our message is always going to be, it can't hurt to write stuff down. I mean, if that sounds like that's going to be something that was maybe a new discovery during this time of, well, actually to access this effectively, the kid does need this support. So the team might want to, put that into the IEP at some point. So I think just as much as you can keep track of, and in terms of new needs or better met needs, that's how it might show up in the school context. So
yeah, so the follow-up is that, would it justify the request for additional supplemental support, such as an ed tech when they go back?
It's possible. It's very possible. Yeah. but it also could be a very special relationship, you know, with the family member that's able for that kid to access this education that we're talking about. So it might be different, but it sounds to me like something great to bring up once school's back in session. So
I can answer this question probably, but Karen was just asking if earbuds could be an accommodation of an IEP, and yes, absolutely, Karen, earbuds could be an accommodation.
Sure. Okay, we're gonna chip away a little bit more here. We've got an hour and 15 under our belt, and this one tied in right when we were talking about evaluation timelines, and there was a lot of people were worried that there was going to be some significant waivers to IDEA coming from DOE, because built into the CARES Act, it explicitly said to US DOE and DeVos, please send us what you want waivers on, and we'll consider those. And so it was pretty limited. I mean, it was, I think, 5 pages, and only one of the pages even mentioned IDEA, and it was limited to a few areas, which we'll touch on. So our interpretation is that there really was no meaningful waivers. What there were was and explicitly, and more helpful was that they were explicitly saying that they're not touching any of the core tenets of IDEA or Section 504, and notably that free and appropriate public education and least restrictive environment is untouched. Those are still intact. So schools can and must provide education to all students, including children with disabilities, all good statements. And then another statement, parents or recipients of services must be informed of and included in decisions relating to the provision of service. So those are all in line with, you know, what we've been telling parents too. So I think there was no surprises from that, and in fact, good to hear coming from the US DOE. And then I think the next slide has the only substantive piece. Oh, this is just to say, this in no way affects the ADA. You know, this was just specifically speaking to IDEA and 504, the waivers. And so ADA is a whole separate law with its own strength, even more strength. And as we talked about, we've been talking about access, equal access, and the ADA is the one that guarantees that. So students with disabilities have access to all the same educational opportunities as other students.
And the ADA was really one of the reasons, you know, we were just counseling people not to freak out too much about the potential for some limited waivers, time limited to the IDEA, because there is this really powerful and underused in the education context civil rights law that you know, what nobody was talking about it going away. So that's why we included it here. But since Monday, we learned they were so limited, you know, that there wasn't real reason to worry. Sorry,
Yeah.
jumping in.
No, that's okay. Yeah, probably half the presentation would have been about those waivers and the impacts of them. So we're relieved that we get to talk, you know, more progressively here. This is just a slide from our typical presentation, but about the ADA in case you don't know. So this is language from the ADA. No qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of disability, be excluded from participation in or denied benefits of services, programs, activities, public entities, or subject to discrimination by any activities. So RA means reasonable accommodation. And so there's a chance that's going to come up often in this COVID closure time, reasonable accommodations. It might be that the IEP doesn't need to be changed or updated. The team doesn't necessarily need to meet, but there might be just specific things. Earpods, was that what they're called? AirPods. That might be the reasonable accommodation. Okay, you know, this wasn't contemplated in the IEP before, but in order to access what the school's providing, the student needs earbuds. So that could be a reasonable accommodation. And there's our only graphic right there, the egg graphic, just showing that ADA is protecting all kids that are IDEA eligible. It's a broader law. So these are all still from our guidance. So here's another topic we hit on was, what can a family do if they do not have the internet access or access to adequate technology for children in the household to participate in distance learning? Again, we've kind of chipped away at this while we've been speaking, but it's important to note DOE explicitly has told us, and you know, the message is out to districts. I don't know if it's necessarily like a public program yet, but they're working on providing Wi-Fi enabled tablets. And then the second part that Atlee didn't mention was also internet access. So the ability to use those Wi-Fi devices. I don't know how many there are, or if it's, I know it was targeted towards a more rural county to initially, but it's something that families should feel like is a potential resource, and to go through their local school first to see if they can access that. And if a student with disability is unable to access distance learning for reasons of their disability, or if instruction's being provided in an inaccessible format, an IEP meeting should be called to address these concerns. So that could be where more discussion about reasonable accommodations could come up that wasn't contemplated in the existing IEP. So it's all about access. You can advance now, Atlee, if you're clicking. A little bit about CDS. So CDS, as you know, as may or may not know, serves the youngest kids birth to 5, and there's a distinction between the different parts of what services are provided for birth to 5. But CDS generally, there was initially a lot of confusion about whether they were open or not, as there was confusion about individual districts. And the answer is CDS is open, just like all schools are. They're open, but things look a lot different. They're not doing any, I actually haven't heard any in-person services being served by CDS, even with precautions. But it's possible it might be going on for a 5-year-old if they're in a residential situation. So there's still a lot of online learning, and it's a pretty natural transition for a lot of CDS services, because a lot of those younger kids are getting services at home anyways. So there's hopefully not much disruption, but I know that if for some reason, I've heard directly from the director of CDS that if for some reason a parent hasn't heard from their CDS case manager, or the office in general, that he wants to know personally, like call him, email him, because that's not the message out to the offices. People should be in touch and working with families. And so this is to highlight one of the substantive parts of the US DOE waiver request from the CARES Act prompt, which is extend the IDA Part B transition evaluation timelines, which is a good waiver. You know, that basically says, let's not be too strict and adherent to these transition between Part B and Part C. Part C being birth through age 3, you know, ending at age 3, and then Part B starting at age 3. So to not be too disruptive of that transition, to be able to allow for kids to keep their Part C services. So they explicitly said toddlers may continue to receive Part C services after his or her 3rd birthday and until Part B is completed. So that was a valuable thing. And we had even heard that from the Maine CDS folks before this came out, but now this backs them up and they'll get the money, I guess. So we can advance to the next one too, unless we got CDS. This is our CDS moment, Carrie, too. So if you've seen any CDS questions, we can hit those.
I just have somebody chiming in saying children are receiving their speech and OT services via teletherapy for CDS. As teachers, we were trying hard to really figure out how to support children who need SDI. I would love to hear from MPF and DRM viewpoints about what that could look like.
So just ways to provide SDI for young kids, is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And hold on, she's raising her hand, so I'm gonna allow her just to, okay. Maybe if she has to unmute. Why won't it let me unmute? Melinda, I've given you there you go. All right. Go ahead if you want to expand.
Make sure you looked at the chat. That's all.
Oh, okay. So your question is good.
Yeah,
you got it.
All. I just would love to hear what we could be doing. That's all.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I know there's a lot going on with, you know, professional development, sharing of ideas of how to deliver all and any instruction. I don't have any magical ways, but certainly if folks are in touch with families, using the IEP as the guide, and making sure kids are getting some services, trying different ways, being creative. I don't know if Atlee had any other.
I would reach out to DOE and ask. I mean, with our guidance, we started it down the road of trying to collect a whole lot of kind of best practice information. There's a lot out there, and there are a lot of places that are aggregating information, and it just got to be really difficult. So we just picked a few kind of highlights, but obviously the younger the student and the less able a student is for whatever reason, age or otherwise, to do kind of anything independently, the more challenging you're going to have in delivering those services. But I know that there are people who have worked through this, the National Technical Assistance Centers for early childhood, I'm sure have good information. I don't have those tips right now, but I know the department, like there are, if you don't know already, and they're open to anybody, if you register, every day the Department of Education has like a suite of online and Zoom and whatever kind of sessions, and so there's ones on social emotional learning, other things, and so I think reaching out to them and asking someone to put together a session on how do we engage students who really can't work independently. That's something that came out a lot in our survey, and it's going to apply to most 4-year-olds, unless somebody's sitting right there with them. But how could you try and adapt it to where you can be less reliant on the adult that's in their home and be more engaging? But there's always going to be kids who just, I have one client that when they tried to do telehealth speech would just walk over and shut the computer every time. And, that just wasn't working. And so we had to find a different way. But, hopefully there are some folks that have already put together a lot of resources for you. And I'm sorry, we don't have a real specific answer.
So I do have some answers coming in through the chat. It says instruction online sessions have been helpful. CDS has been calling parents and sending packets via teletherapy. Providing SDI through therapy with one student using puppets was another idea. There was an example of that on one of the special education Zoom webinars, which are all recorded and happening daily at 10 o'clock. So you could take a look at that. Just want to make sure. Melinda just said, yes, I haven't found much relevant to our situation. I've been providing story readings and games via online platforms and have started this week setting up one-to-one Zoom meetings with students. So I would also say on May 14th, Thursday, May 14th, we are working with the Center for Community Inclusion and Disability Services, as well as Mainly Kids, who provides therapies, and a mental health person to speak directly to some naturalistic approaches to learning and instructing at home. So I would encourage you to register for that webinar because that will give you some additional ideas as well. Somebody said break built-in emotional regulation pairing with teachers. Somebody's asking about the PowerPoint, and yes, we will make that available on our website. I will post the links to the website at the end of this webinar for that information. And teachers making agenda and erasing it when completed. So checking off when you've completed something or you've done something. That completion can oftentimes feel good. What should occur? Oh, go ahead.
I would just say that there is this overload of resources, and that was some of the complaints of parents too, just from the districts. And so I would use the same advice as with CDS, which is, ask CDS, ask the district, okay, I've got all this stuff. I've seen all the links. I've seen the website, but I need some direction. I need you to cherry pick for me, So I think there's a role there for the entity, the school entity to direct better.
Yeah. What should occur for 3 to 4-year-olds to access speech therapy or OT if they were in CDS early intervention programs and getting those either in person or telehealth before at the school? So, I mean, what's difficult about these younger kiddos is that even though we're doing a lot of telehealth for our daughter who's 13, for kiddos K through 3rd grade, and even those 4th and 5th graders, it takes parent involvement for 3 to 4 year olds. It's an absolute must that a parent is sitting down at a computer next to the child to make sure that they're remaining engaged. And I think that's probably one of the biggest obstacles is to access the telehealth, is making sure that, like, for example, tonight my husband was out. I was on this webinar. My daughter's OT started at 4. I didn't know if he was going to make it back in time. I was relying on my 15-year-old to get her set up for her OT appointment. My husband made it back in time, but those are the things that happen. We all have work appointments. We all have other things going on, other children we're trying to educate. And so that's the biggest obstacle, is it absolutely requires for a 3 to 4 year old to take advantage of some sort of telehealth, whether it be SDI or therapy, for the parent to be involved and engaged, to keep that child involved and engaged. And I'm not sure I have any real good advice for that. But some of the naturalistic approaches that you can do that doesn't involve telehealth, that you can do just when you're going outside for a walk with your family, or we're all eating 3 meals a day together. So preparing those meals together can be some OT. Pen pal letters. We've struck up 2 pen pals for Sammy. And so writing has provided her with the ability to keyboard, a lot of English language arts stuff going on, some speech therapy back and forth. So those naturalistic approaches to some of this learning, where it can just be everyday activities and not necessarily sitting in front of a computer, are helpful. And hopefully on May 14th, there'll be other ideas than what I've just given you. But that was our concept for May 14th, is to try to help some of these families who are struggling with what's being provided to be able to do on their own when all else is failing.
Yeah. And thanks again to Maine Parent Federation. You guys have already done, I think, 3 or 4 of these style of trainings, and you're now going to be seen as the experts, and we're all going to go to you to how to run a meeting. So they've been going great. Thank you guys for doing that.
Well, thank you for attending today and for the compliment.
So let's forge ahead a little bit. We touched on this a bit, and I think the caveat to this particular question is that within your capacity, you want to do what you can to keep track of what's going on at home, but some folks are so overwhelmed, it's the most you can do to just even squeeze in 10 minutes of any kind of instruction. So if you do have the capacity to do so, keep track of what you can keep track of. And we talked about communication, keep in touch with the school as best you can. And in terms of keeping track, you can use the IEP as a guide and say, okay, well, there was some amount of OT, some amount of speech during each week, and we accessed X amount. That'll become important later when folks are talking about what kiddos missed out on. But again, we're not really advising folks to get too hung up on minute for minute, hour for hour, because it's really going to be where does the school find the student when they arrive. So do your best to keep track of how kids are doing. I think more importantly, just overall how kids are doing. Not that they access 10 out of 30 minutes that they should have had, but more of, are they progressing, regressing? What aspects of a service or instruction are they able to access? So we can go to the next one, Atlee, if you're still there. So continuing on of what you should do to get needs met during this time. Remote learning options, specific requests. So we talked about reasonable accommodations and staying in touch with the school. Again, if you have the capacity to do so, just rip off a quick email, if you have an email, to the school and say, we've tried 4 times to do speech this week. We had the packet that you gave us. It's just not working. Can you suggest something else, or should we have a meeting? So stay in touch as best you can and keep track of things. And just let them know you're available. That was some of the issues came up that when I was talking to current clients, was that they were saying, well, I haven't heard much. They reached out and then we missed each other. And I was just saying, let them know you're available for a meeting, whether it's remote or over the phone, whatever it is, just be the one who's available. And so you have that connection maintained. So have we had any other or 60 more questions come in since?
No, keep going. I'll let you know. Keep going.
All right. Am I still going, Atlee, or are we switching here? Oh, okay. I'll do this last one. So what else should I be doing to get my child's needs met? Remember the core principles of IDEA. So we're going to do a quick little overview. Usually this next coming section is a full couple hours, but I think we'll do it in maybe 10. And insist on equal access. You know, that could be your cheering flag, is I just want my kid to have access to the same thing every other kids are getting, and here's how they get it.
And so, Carrie, on timing, when do you want us to stop? Because I mean, Ben's right. It usually does take a long time to run through this next piece, and it may be more beneficial if people just have more questions and we have more conversation. I mean, we'd want to wrap up by 5:30 at the latest. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we can.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I could just hit a couple of the high points. It's just more to basically say, like, you know, in this time, you know, the core of the law hasn't changed. So just, you know, kind of here are the things to be thinking about. And then we could have more questions and wrap up a little early if that's what, you know, if that's where the questions lead. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Okay. So just really quickly, this is the IDEA in one slide as far as I'm concerned. And all these things should still be happening now. There's no suspension to duties to identify kids that might have a disability. There's no suspension to duties to evaluate. Those are going to be difficult, right? There are complications to these things, but it doesn't. The law is not on pause, right? So there may be practical complications to evaluations, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be moving forward when we can on what we can. Serving students by providing a FAPE in the LRE, we'll talk about those things. LRE is the thing that's most impacted. I mean, we're all feeling like we're in a fairly restrictive setting right now. And then procedural safeguards and parental involvement is still, is still the rule. And it was clear in the DeVos letter that those types of things, are still, parental involvement and meetings and all that, that's not being waived. So things are different, but the core of everything is still there. So it's just a good reminder. I do want to, so FAPE, this is, I usually spend a long time talking about this slide, but I do want to address one thing. And that is the Andrew F. case, which is the 2017, it was the first case since 1982 that talked about what does it mean, what does a free and appropriate public education mean? And it really resulted in kind of two standards, really. You've got the core standard, which means you're providing services that are reasonably calculated to permit advancement through the general curriculum. So that should be the measure for most students. The majority of students is, are we supporting them to access and to move through successfully the general education curriculum? For a small number of students, the court kind of created the second standard, and that means you're providing an education that's reasonably calculated to enable them to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances. And there's good language in that opinion about that. For this second kind of standard, it has to be appropriately ambitious. What does that mean? Well, that'll probably get litigated for a long time, but it's still a good phrase, has to be appropriately ambitious and designed to help students meet challenging objectives. So, so even though there's kind of a subset of students that the court is saying we know aren't going to access and succeed in the general education curriculum, although the vast majority should get the services they need to do that, for everybody else, we still need appropriately ambitious objectives and challenging objectives. The reason I wanted to talk about this, though, is this language, appropriate in light of their circumstances. Initially, there were, and there still are, people that are pushing kind of the line that, well, what this really means is that right now everybody's circumstances are that we have a COVID educational disruption. It's just, you shouldn't be having this case thrown at you to basically say that the FAPE, the standard for FAPE is reduced because of COVID. It's not. Now there are practical realities in accessing it and all kinds of other things, and we might all need to take a longer time horizon. But that is a misuse of this law, and the Supreme Court obviously wasn't thinking in 2017 about this type of disruption. So I just don't, I don't think it's something that that when it's used that way, we should push back on it. But generally, that's the FAPE standard, and it's still the FAPE standard. So LRE is a little bit out the window right now, but there may be situations where, especially coming back to school, and I just want to underscore this, is that it's our hope that, again, schools will be planning for getting everybody back in ways that address the social, emotional, behavioral needs that have arisen from this across the general population. And so I want to make sure that students with disabilities have access to all that good stuff. So there may be ways in which the team may want to meet and discuss to say, especially for the beginning of the year and what supports they would need, are we going to make some adjustments to the least restrictive environment? Are we going to ensure that that my child has access to all these things that may be going on? Maybe I'm assuming too much. Maybe I'm just being too hopeful. But I do think that potentially revisiting the LRE, the placement of a child coming back from this could be appropriate depending on the circumstances. So, but right now, everybody's in the same placement right now, and that's at their home. So I'm not going to go through this piece with IEP, but all these things are still there, and I just want to highlight a couple things that are going to be particularly important. The present levels of performance, like revisiting that on return to school, is going to be hugely important for everyone, because again, some students are going to have been able to maintain their skills, and for those students we probably need to think about like having more ambitious goals, right? Because they will have surprised us in ways that they've maintained skills even given this disruption. Other students are going to have regressed, and we have to figure out where students are in relation to their IEP goals when we come back from this. And so all IEP teams should be looking at that. We should be doing curriculum-based measures. We should be doing other things to just get a sense of where students are. A lot of that should be happening, now. I mean, if we're getting instruction, then we should be measuring that in some way. And again, there are schools that are doing that, certainly. And then there are other schools that it's what can I print off on a Sunday afternoon? And those schools are likely going to see their students regress, more, I would imagine. So that's the big one, I think, to be thinking about with regard to this. Annual goals may need to be revisited, but I'd be real careful with that. I think more it's the services may need to be increased to support progress toward the annual goals. Just like you don't want to reduce the services in the IEP now just because they can't be provided, you don't want to reduce the goals just because there's been a regression because of this disruption. But you may need additional services or different services to meet those goals.
Atlee, what if a teacher is providing a classroom lesson like on a Facebook platform and a family doesn't have Facebook and doesn't want to open up a Facebook account so they don't have access to it? Yeah,
that seems that the schools need to change the platform. I mean, the family shouldn't have to. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. They should work with the family and ensure that the child has access. I mean, well, this right now, we're doing this on Zoom and on Facebook at the same time. So that sounds like a solution right there. I'm not sure how we're doing it. This all seems still magic to me. Yeah, it took a 22-year-old youth coordinator who works for me named Dylan Campbell to help me figure it out. Well, at any rate, so that seems like a solution right there. But families shouldn't be forced to sign up for things that they have a objection to for whatever reason, so they can access instruction. It's Sarah Baldwin says they're using Google Hangout, and that's one of the biggest platforms that are being used by schools right now is Google Hangout, which everybody has access to. Right. So I'm not going to go through too much of this, but again, this is what we have to consider when we develop IEPs, and I think whether kids have their annual due or not, at some point pretty early in the return, teams are going to want to get together, and it's going to be a crush of meetings, and people are going to have to figure out how to navigate that. I think that technology is going to be one way to kind of do that, to make sure related service providers and others can be can use their time efficiently and still provide meaningful input to the IEP teams. So not going to read all these things to you, but it's just a reminder, these are the core kind of components of an IEP, the meat of it. You have specially designed instruction, and it really always should be designed to do two things. And I think coming back from this disruption, it's important to think about both. So you're adapting the content methodology or delivery of instruction, and you have two goals. You have to address disability related needs, so remediate them, build skills, right? But then also at the same time, you're ensure access to the general education curriculum. So it's just important to keep those dual prongs in mind for the purposes of specially designed instruction. And then related services, we talked a bit about that, and I've underlined on the slide, or Ben did that for me, and that was helpful, to say parent counseling and training. That may be one you might want to add after this, but there's all kinds of related services that might be required, may need to be increased as we return, and so it's good to think about that. And then supplementary aids and services, both now and in the future and the return. So what supports are needed to enable children with disabilities to be educated with their peers to the maximum extent appropriate, to access the general education curriculum. And then just, again, when we come back to IEP meetings, it should be, and I know it doesn't feel this way to a lot of parents sometimes, but you should be an equal participant in this meeting. And you're gonna have a lot to say after this, because you're the one you're always the one who is the expert on your child, but even more so now, you're getting a window into how have they been interacting with the curriculum in a way that you haven't before, and your voice is going to be vital in these meetings coming back. And you may have some disputes. The team needs to work towards consensus, but if you can't reach that consensus, the district has to show their work and put it in a written notice, and then you can decide whether you're going to challenge that or not. So I just wanted to kind of remind everybody about those things, that we're in a kind of an unprecedented disruption right now, but the IDEA, as we learned on Monday, is not going to change in any significant way. And so it's just a good reminder of the core tenets of it, and that, you have an equal right to participate in this team. You examine all the records, participate in meetings, and have written notice anytime the school says what they want to do, or importantly, refuses to make a change that you've requested. If you say, my child's needs have changed in such and such a way, and I want you to do this, and they say no, they have to explain why in a written notice, and then you can decide whether you're going to challenge that. So I'm going to advance through that and just basically say we'll spend as long as people want to on questions between now and 5:30, or we can all just sign off. So up to you, Carrie, what you want to do.
What I'll do is, if you can stop sharing your screen, Atlee, I'll lodge the poll, and people can start filling that out for us. And please tell me if you're not seeing it. Do you guys see it?
I just posted. I see it.
Okay, great. So if you're seeing it, everybody else is seeing it. So if everybody would please take a few moments to just answer these quick 8 questions, that would be great. And we will hang out while you do that. If anybody else has any other questions, please post them in the chat box or the Q&A and let us know, and we will get those answered for you.
It says a host and panelists cannot vote. I feel disenfranchised here.
Sorry, yeah.
We'd be biased now.
We can't vote for ourselves. But thank you guys. I know it went longer than we had anticipated, but there were a lot of great questions. I felt like we definitely have met the needs of our families and professionals who have attended.
No, thank you so much for having us. And this really went, I'm amazed at how smoothly this went for how many folks are on the call and on Facebook. Yeah. I appreciate all the questions, and please reach out if you need support for an intake. Yeah,
thank you so much.
Sounds like we should be thanking Dylan mostly. He's the 20.
Yeah, well, Dylan has got us up and running, and keeping us all technically savvy. We appreciate you at DRM. Thank you, Christine Walker says. Getting a lot of thanks. Thanks, everyone. It won't let me submit the poll. Interesting, Carrie. I'm not sure. We're getting answers coming in. if you want, Carrie, if you want to send me email address, I will, I can send you the poll via email. I'm also going to post our website where you'll be able to find the recorded version of this webinar, and where we're going to post Ben and Atlee's materials. Oh, Carrie, you might want to check and see if you missed a question on the poll. If you missed a question, it might not be allowing you to submit. And I got a question. Oh, Carrie says she got it. Thank you, Carrie. I'm an administrator at CDS. I plan to encourage my team to watch this webinar. It was great. Thank you. That's awesome. Thank you for doing that. Great information and time to examine my child's needs. Thank you. Maine Parent Federation, thank you. This was very helpful. So please, if you've finished the poll and you don't have any questions, you can feel free to log off at this time. We're just going to hang out for a few more moments to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs before we disconnect. And people are excellent and very timely information. Thank you. So I think at this point in time, Ben and Atlee, people are logging off and have completed the polling. We got 100% completion. So I'm going to end the polling right now. And I want to thank you two again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you as well.
And hopefully the weather will start cooperating and we'll have a good weekend. So enjoy the rest of your week, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to end the meeting now. If anybody has any other questions or concerns that you feel didn't get answered, please feel free to email us at Maine Parent Federation. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and upcoming weekend.